Ciao a tutti ragazzi! Con questo episodio inizia la nostra serie di podcast. Oggi con noi c'è Maisy dagli Stati Uniti e tra poco la conoscerete, ma prima sigla! Today, here with us, there's Maisy. She's a climate change activist from California in the USA, and it's a real pleasure to have her here today. Hi, Maisy.
Thank you. I'm excited.
I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk with you today. So, when and how did you start being interested in the climate crisis?
So my sophomore year in high school, which was 2 years ago, I was taking chemistry, and we did a unit on carbon and CO2 emissions. And my chemistry teacher brought up how the Trump administration believed that deforestation was carbon neutral because, in theory, trees, they sequester carbon, so they're like absorbing carbon, and then when you cut them down, it releases the same amount of carbon. But in reality, that's not true, because when you're destroying forests, that brings up a lot more carbon from the ground and from animals that you're killing. And so I just found it really interesting that we could debunk this myth that literally the government in my country believes that's totally not true. And so since then, since chemistry, I've been really into science, and I've been really into environmental activism. Um, and so last year, being a junior in high school, I got really into it. I think a lot of people initially learn about the climate change movement from Greta Thunberg just because she's um, created this really big movement. So I got really inspired by her, and then I started researching more activists and going to marches. And this past year in the fall at my school, I became a part of the Sunrise Movement, which is an organization here in the US that's mostly just here in the US. And it focuses on pushing through the Green New Deal, which is a big kind of like framework for environmental policy in the US government. So I'm a part of that. I kind of like lead the hub, the group that we have at my school for Sunrise. And yeah, that's pretty much my involvement right now. And then I created Humans of Quarantine to talk about different stories that teenagers have right now in quarantine all around the world. And I thought it would be really cool to reach out to climate activists, just because I know that it's frustrating to be inside right now when we really want to like fight and protest.
The movement you're part of, the Sunrise Movement, is it mostly made of schools and young people, or is it participated by people out of school?
So the Sunrise Movement, it's not all youth, so it's characterized as like young people, as 35 and below. So the entire movement's made up of people 35 and below. I have a group at my school, so I'm the president of the environmental club at my school, and we also started the Sunrise hub at my school. So Sunrise hubs can be at schools, they can be for towns, they can be for all over the place, but it's definitely very teenage heavy as far as the leadership, and a lot of the people who are like kind of high up in the ranks. So this past week, I actually took a class through Sunrise about the Green New Deal, and just about how we can push that forward even through this global health crisis. And that was taught by two teenagers who are actually younger than me. So I thought that was really cool, and it's definitely has a lot of teenage leadership, which I find really inspiring.
Your fight against climate crisis is really inspiring. I know you have a project that involves a lot of activists around the world, and it would be amazing to let people know about it, because I think it is really important. So why don't you explain it a little?
Yeah, so I think what's so beautiful about the climate change movement is that it is so global, because it will impact every single person on the planet. So I've talked to a lot of different activists over these past few weeks, interviewing for my Humans of Quarantine, or the page that I started with my sister. So I interviewed you from Italy, and that was a really cool experience. You were like the first activist I actually interviewed, and since then I've interviewed a lot more. So like I was talking to a girl from New Zealand the other day, and she was saying how her prime minister has reacted to the crisis really well, the um, coronavirus pandemic. And so she said that after quarantine, she and her group want to start pushing for the prime minister to treat the climate crisis like this global health crisis. I've talked to um, I talked to a girl from Costa Rica who is part of Fridays for Future. And I've talked to people from Pakistan, and I've talked to people from Latvia, which is like Northern Europe. To be honest, I didn't really know where it was. And so I had to look it up. And yeah, so I got to talk to her, and it was cool because her name was Leva. She wasn't only interested in environmental activism, but also like animal rights. And she was like a vegan. And so we got to talk about that. And it's just been so cool to bond with people who seem like so different and literally like across the world, but you have things in common. And I think that's a really cool thing. Um, yeah.
So you live in California in the USA. How is climate crisis treated there?
Um, so it's interesting because I feel like California, in a way, is its own world in the US. It's known throughout the US, and I think maybe throughout the world, that California is a lot more progressive. um, and it does have a lot more, a more of an open mind, I feel like. And so being a climate activist in California is actually like pretty cool, and it's always easy to find people who are interested in the same things you are. I live in a really small town, but I still have a lot of my friends who are part of environmental activism movements and things like that. But at the same time, it's also really hard to be an environmental activist here, just because there's so many other problems that are going on and so many other systemic issues, like in the government, and like our president doesn't believe in climate change, which is absolutely embarrassing for us. And then there's also just a lot of because of Trump, he's ignited this entire like dark and underbelly of the US of racism and xenophobia and sexism and homophobia and all of these terrible things that otherwise I think people before Trump's presidency, it really wasn't exposed that much. And so I think a lot of people delegitimize the climate crisis here in the US because we have so many other issues we should be dealing with, or we could be dealing with. And so they're saying, like, well, police brutality, that's more important because people are currently being killed versus climate change. Like, who even knows if it exists? Like, we can't even see it happening. So in the US, I think there's a lot to fight for, which is why, like, I'm not only a climate activist, but a social justice activist, and a lot of other things. So it's kind of, as far as being able to be an activist in the US, it's kind of across the board. Like freedom of speech is really big here, and so obviously we have the right to protest, but there's also just a lot of people who don't believe in climate change, a lot of people who delegitimize the work that we're doing and trying to do, and the awareness we're trying to raise, and all of that. So I remember I was watching an interview that Greta Thunberg did with Trevor Noah, who was like a late night show host here, and he asked what it was like talking about climate justice and climate activism here. And she was saying that it's interesting because here you have to convince people that climate change exists versus you go to the rest of the world and people already believe it. So yeah, I feel like that's how I feel here. I'm able to protest, but it's also hard because there are a lot of people who don't believe it, who think it isn't important, things like that.
How do people see activism in the USA? You said activists are mostly young people, as in a lot of other countries in the world, but other people take it seriously or they just don't believe in it?
I think it just is a spectrum. It's totally a spectrum. Like, I'm a big climate activist. My sister's a big climate activist. A lot of my friends are big climate activists. But then, like, my dad, he recognizes that climate change is real because, um, because he respects our activism and things that we do, but he's not really interested in striking, and he's not really willing to. He has an electric car, but otherwise he's not really willing to change his like lifestyle to be more like carbon neutral. So I think there's a lot of people like that who know about it and just don't really care. There are a lot of really radical climate change activists who are like really preach veganism, and who I went to a climate strike this fall, and there are a lot of people I find who are preaching veganism and then say like, if you're not a vegan, you shouldn't even be here. Like, it's not worth fighting and like being a climate activist if you're not a vegan, because otherwise like you're just not even really doing anything. And so there's that end of the activist spectrum, and then there's the completely other end of, obviously people who don't even believe in climate change. I would say that I think it's really important to just like be inclusive when you're being an activist. Like, okay, some people aren't vegan, and that's totally okay. I'm not vegan, like I'm vegetarian because like for health reasons, like I'm just doing all that I can to, like not eat animals. But yeah, I would really just say it really is a spectrum in the US. The US is a total melting pot of beliefs and people, and that whole held true hundreds of years ago, and it does today too. So I would say youth definitely make up the majority of the climate change movement, just because I'm not really sure why actually, but I think it's really interesting to me, and I'm really passionate about it, versus older people maybe aren't willing to change their ways so late in life. Um, but yeah, it's a really beautiful movement, all the people I've met from it. But I've also gotten a lot of backlash that's been disappointing.
There are other people in your family that are activists. Are they in the same movement you are?
Yeah, so I would say I have a twin sister, and so the two of us are really into activism. We both have gone to a lot of marches, and we both really work together at our school to kind of like run an environmental club. And then my little sister, she likes to come to the marches with us and stuff, but she is a lot less outspoken. She likes getting off of school to be over to be able to march. I think that's what she finds most interesting. Um, and then my parents are really supportive, and they'll drive us to places if we need it. But I wouldn't say necessarily that they're like a big part of the movement. Um, and I feel like that's how it is a lot from the people I know. I've had debates with my uncle, because all of my family, both my mom's side and my dad's side, they all live on the East Coast, which is a lot more conservative, I would say, depending on where you go. So I've had debates with my uncle who voted for Trump about like climate policy and climate change. And I was like talking to him once, and I said, well, do you believe in climate change? And he said, I definitely believe in climate change, like the climate's always changing. But he was like, I don't think that humans necessarily contribute to all of the ways that the climate is warming. And I think that I was like, well, what about like the Paris Agreement and us pulling out of it? What do you think about that? And he said, well, if you really look um, at the different ways that the US is implementing electric cars and like solar energy, we're actually doing better than the rest of the world. And I've talked, which is completely untrue. And if you, I was talking to my grandparents, and they were saying, well, actually it's just India and China who are contributing to all of global warming. They need to pull their own weight, even because we're not making as much of a carbon footprint the US. And it's a lot of ignorance like that, when people think that it's like not ours to take blame for, even though like the US obviously is a huge manufacturing world power. So it's frustrating to have conversations with people like my extended family who just don't care about it for their own reasons, and it's really hard to convince them otherwise. But I am lucky enough that in my direct family I have a lot of support, and like both my sisters who love uh, striking with me. It's really fun.
How is being an activist seen by the Californian USA population? Do you think the USA is doing really big progresses about the fight against climate crisis and it is really trying to change, or is it just little action that are not actually enough?
Yeah, I would say the US as a whole is doing a really not preparing in any way, shape, or form for the repercussions that the climate crisis will have 10 years, 15 years down the line. Um, it's interesting because the US loves to say, like our First Amendment is freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And so obviously protesting and being an activist is totally supported as a whole. But of climate activists are a lot of climate activists are like liberal or Democrat, I would say, at least the ones that I know. And so because right now our government is so conservative and so like right wing, um, climate activism is delegitimized a lot, and the climate change movement as a whole and climate change is delegitimized a lot, and just called like a hoax and like something that the Democrats are making up to take away from real problems. A big argument for why the Green New Deal wouldn't work is because it would take too much money. But in reality, Trump has put literally like 100 billion extra dollars in funding to the military during his time as president, which we really do 100% do not need. We're bailing out like Wall Street and banks every single day for if the economy crashes. I think the money obviously is there. The US is extremely wealthy in a lot of ways. And so it's frustrating when people just say that we can't pay for the Green New Deal because of whatever reason. But in reality, if we've always found money for things that we've prioritized, so that's just not an acceptable excuse in my eyes as to why we didn't have climate legislation. Um, so it's just frustrating when the US government isn't supportive of literally our entire planet and the well being of our planet. The end of this year are the elections, so hopefully Trump will finally be out of office. But I really loved Bernie Sanders. I don't know if you guys know about Sanders, but he's great. He was pushing for the Green New Deal a lot in his campaign, saying that we'll finally like have some climate legislation, which is awesome. But unfortunately, Bernie had to drop out of the race, and so the Democratic nominee will probably be Joe Biden, who I really don't like. Anyone's better over Trump in my eyes. And so Joe Biden, unfortunately, isn't a big climate activist and doesn't really have plans to push through any environmental legislation. Um, so I definitely plan to, hopefully, when Trump is out of office, I definitely plan to continue to protest, for um, climate laws and change and awareness and all of that. And I think hopefully it'll go a little bit better protesting with the Democratic president than it has so far with the Republican president.
Okay, here we are with the last question. In your opinion, what is the bigger problem concerning climate crisis in California and the USA, and what should be the first step to solve it?
There are so many factors in climate change. There are so many contributors to greenhouse gases. One big reason why a lot of people don't support the Green New Deal is because they think it's going to totally shut down like international transportation and like planes, and that you can't have your gas car. But I think that the most important thing we need to be able to do is have sustainable agriculture. And that really just goes for all over the world, but especially in the US, we have a lot of like states even that are completely dedicated to agriculture and farming, and cows especially, and all animals have a huge contribution to greenhouse gases. And so I think if we had a lot more people who were either vegetarian or vegan, if if that became like more accessible and affordable to people, I think that would be a really like beautiful change that we could have. And then also just agriculture in general, aside from livestock. So just learning how to farm a lot more like native plants, and learning how to not totally destroy the soil with pesticides, and learning how to farm in responsible ways without like soil degradation. And I mean, organic farming is a really great way to deal with that. It's just that it then becomes a lot more expensive. Um, so I think especially in the US, there's a lot of health and income inequity. And it's just like when you start going into like, well, how can we solve climate change? It then becomes an entire you realize that it's a huge systemic change. It's not just like, oh, we're just going to start driving electric cars and some people go vegetarian. It's like, well, we have to make farming, like organic food, accessible. And then that means that a lot of low income people will need to be able to afford it. And then you go, well, why is there like a huge homeless and low income population in the US? Well, because there's the top 1% that owns so much like company and real estate and all of this. And you just realize kind of how corrupt all of the US is. So it's hard to say what the one or two, three things we could do is in the US to try and cut down on emissions and all of that. So I think it's hard, and that's another reason why so many people are against the Green New Deal, because it would really be a huge systemic change, but it's necessary and it's going to have to happen eventually. And I think it'd be better for it to happen now than later when the world is like burning up. So, yeah.
It has been a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you because you agreed to be our guest. This interview has been really inspiring and I hope we will keep in touch. So again, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This has been awesome.
Ringrazio ancora Maisy per essersi resa disponibile oggi. Come avete sentito, Maisy fa un sacco di cose fantastiche e io sono stata onorata di averla come nostra ospite. Ringrazio voi che avete seguito questo podcast fino a questo momento e vi ricordo che potete seguirci sulle nostre pagine Instagram, Facebook, sul nostro canale YouTube e sul nostro sito online. Intanto noi ci sentiamo al prossimo episodio.